Hello, everyone. Welcome again to Coaching the Bible, the Indecision series. This is Season 5, Episode 2, number 215 overall. I want to thank those who got back to me after last week's episode on indecision. It's a new thing that I'm trying. We'll talk about it over the course of the year. We won't do it every single week, but there's a lot to unpack in the decision-making abilities and learnings from those people who we hold dearly, excuse me, a little under the weather this week, in the Bible. So this week's presentation is on Noah's choices. I'm going to talk about obedience again a little bit. We're going to talk about silence. We'll talk about the cost of renewal in understanding what is involved in Noah. So here we go. Today, as we're studying and journeying into the story of Noah, there's a lot of decisions that he has to go through. I have never had to make a decision or to take an action that had the full weight of the entire world on my shoulders. The entire world population. So it's impossible, I think on many levels, to step into the shoes of Noah. Jonah. We'll talk about Jonah in just a few minutes. Of Noah. I've made important decisions. I've made maybe some life-altering decisions as it relates to myself and my immediate family. I've answered questions in the past when I was in the rabbinate that had real significance and held significant weight for people. But nothing to the level and the degree that Noah has to deal with in this week's reading. And I would say that Noah's journey, as much as the story itself is about an ark, is really not about building an ark. It's really about navigating a series of profound and challenging decisions that force him to question his values, his loyalty, and his very humanity. These are universe-altering choices that span effectively 3 stages in his life: before the flood, during the flood, and after the flood. There's really no other way to describe or break down Noah's life. Before the flood, he has to make 2 critical decisions. He has to accept an unfathomable task. He has to commit to that level of obedience without evidence about what's to be. And he has to make a decision about what to do with that knowledge. Effectively, in his case, embracing silence, both towards God and the judgment that God has made, and also towards his generation. During the flood, he has to deal with complete isolation within the ark other than his family and the animals, shouldering that maybe survivor's guilt that his choices alone have preserved and destroyed life on some level. And then even when the waters recede and now he emerges from the ark into an empty world to now rebuild, he carries the emotional cost and the emotional weight of everything and everyone that's lost. And how do you do that? How do you decide to rebuild after unfathomable, unconscionable levels of loss? Each stage calls on Noah to balance a sense of obedience with unimaginable responsibility, a sense of resilience with solitude, and faith with a heavy weight of silence. And as we therefore reflect on Noah's decision, let's keep in mind a quote from Martin Luther King. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. Today, we can explore all those choices. We're simply going to focus into the period of time before the flood actually begins. The 2 decisions, effectively, that Noah makes before the flood happens: the decision to obey and the decision to remain silent, and then how those effectively impact his life and his legacy. So I want you to imagine the world of Noah as it was in the time of the story as it unfolds in the Bible. It's a society marked with unrestrained violence, corruption, and a complete disregard for moral boundaries. People are driven by their own desires and lusts and ambitions, with little to no concern for justice or compassion. In this world, cruelty and selfishness have become the norm, a place where honesty and kindness are rare, if not entirely absent. Noah is surrounded by a society so corrupted that it seems beyond redemption, a world where the pursuit of personal gain has overshadowed any sense of shared responsibility or integrity. You might look at today and think that today is some sort of a society that is so corrupted to that degree. We're not in a position that we have a Noah around that is building an ark. We're not in a position to have the word of God in our hand to know for sure. But let's, for the moment, say that our world is not as irredeemable as the world of Noah. The Bible tells us that God looked upon this corruption, this rampant level of corruption, seeing how far humanity had strayed from his ideal, and effectively God decides to cleanse the earth of humanity. Except for Noah. He's described as righteous, someone who walks with God, in a way, in a manner that is clearly different and distinct from everyone else around him. And he's the one that God chooses to build the ark, that God chooses to rebuild the world with, his partner in humanity after the flood is over. God commands him to build the ark, explaining that the flood will come to restore the world, sparing only Noah, his family, and the creatures that he will gather. But even with the context, the command itself is profoundly shocking. Yes, Noah can see what's going on around him. He can see how bad or how far the world has fallen since he was born all those years ago, or maybe what he'd learned from his ancestors, to see what's going on around him. But imagine receiving instructions to prepare for an event of such magnitude, one that will ultimately end life for everyone on earth as you know it, including yourself, because your life is going to be fundamentally different after. He is now faced with a task that seems unfathomable, and it's one that will separate him from his world and isolate him completely if it is that he chooses to accept the mission. So let's appreciate now for a moment the scope of Noah's obedience. Noah, in the space of this command, one must appreciate that it's more than just a task or a list of tasks. This is a test of absolute obedience in the face of the unknown. It's absolute obedience in the space of his faith, but without the evidence to show it. He has no proof, no visible signs of impending catastrophe, yet he chooses to act. He chooses to listen. He chooses to obey without question, which highlights a profound sense of moral courage, a willingness to set aside reason, comfort, and perhaps even his own doubts to fulfill a task that has no visible foundation in reality. It's not like there's a gathering storm outside his window. There's no rain, there's no clouds, there's nothing. There's simply just a command from God. He has to surrender his own judgment and follow a command that others around him would and will likely mock or condemn as madness. Imagine him in this world, explaining his actions to his family, who love him dearly, who revere him immensely, but who perhaps question his sanity or practicality with such a command. Why build an ark here? Why build an ark now? What if the flood never comes? And yet day after day, Noah persists, investing himself in a vision that only he can see, trusting that his obedience has value beyond what others might understand. Let's appreciate the psychological side of this decision. It's a rare level of cognitive dissonance that Noah is able to endure. A tension between holding a belief without the external validation. For Noah, the obedience here means existing in a dual reality. The world he sees around him and the unseen reality of the flood that he has been told to prepare for. This level of obedience for Noah requires a deep tolerance for ambiguity, an ability to hold two conflicting truths and proceed without resolution. Many people struggle to simply carry one truth, but to carry two truths, the truth that is now and the truth that is in the future, the truth that he sees and the truth that God describes, are completely in conflict. The dissonance could or should be overwhelming. Noah's tolerance, though, is not passive. It's a commitment to proceed in the face of the dissonance, to let go of the desire for proof and instead rely on conviction alone. This choice to act on faith also reflects what I would call a radical level of surrender. Noah surrenders not just his time or his resources, but his entire worldview to a command that defies logic. He may be the first to do that. He's not the last in the Bible to have to go through that. His obedience is a form of psychological strength, a resilience that allows him to continue despite the lack of understanding from those around him. Noah's surrender reveals a deep faith, a deep level of faith that is willing to act in darkness, believing that the purpose itself is sufficient to justify his efforts. A lot of us would crumble under that kind of pressure, that kind of ambiguity, that kind of dissonance, that kind of struggle. But to put it in the modern context, imagine a leader today who feels called to act on a set of principles that they value above profit. Maybe it's to take a company that's operating in the public sphere and to turn it from a profit endeavor into a nonprofit. Maybe it's to change fundamentally the character of a business to being what you might call a double or a triple bottom line kind of a business and operation that has a moral compass, that has a moral focus, that has a space in social impact and not just on profit. Maybe it's taking a company that operates a certain way and looking at it from the space of sustainability, where everyone around you tells you that that's crazy or that those changing into those practices will be slower growth, smaller profits, potential risks and dangers to the entity. The leader, like Noah, faces heavy levels of skepticism, perhaps even ridicule in the press and the public. Imagine what they'd say on Twitter, even as they pursue a vision that others in reality cannot see. But for them, for that leader, for that Noah, it's not about the immediate results. It's about laying a foundation for something far, far greater. Their commitment to an unseen value becomes an act of courage, a choice to stand for purpose even when no one else understands or supports their cause. That should ring true and resonate with anyone operating and existing in the world today, whether that's in the political space, whether that's in the space of the ethics, the moralities of the wars that are going on, the protests on campus, the anti-Semitism that people see and experience around them. We spent all of the beginning of Genesis last year talking about moral clarity, moral courage, moral truth. Imagine the sacrifices that these leaders have to make, the potential isolation from colleagues, potentially firings, delayed results, or even ridicule for being too idealistic. Like Noah, they might question their own decisions, yet find themselves anchored by a conviction that goes beyond the profits or beyond the approval. For this leader, the daily decision to stay committed to their vision becomes both a challenge and a source of strength, pushing them to act with resilience and to find meaning beyond what others can see. Now stop for a minute and reflect for yourself. When in your life have you chosen to act on a belief or principle that seemed irrational to others and felt deeply aligned with your values? Your own personal congruence versus the incongruence that others sensed or feel. Your own sense of unity as opposed to the dissonance. Did the doubt that others shared make you reconsider? Did it make you question? Or did it strengthen your resolve? Have you ever pursued a purpose without immediate results or validation, trusting that it held value in and of itself? The pluses and minuses are of question. The value is not of question. What did you learn from that experience about your faith, about faith in general, about resilience, about your resilience, how tough you are, how strong you are, what you can stand up against, what you can stand up to, how far you can push yourself in those spaces? How did you manage the tension between your internal convictions and the lack of external support? That's hard. It's really hard. Or when has obedience to an unseen purpose changed your own identity or your sense of self? These are all the questions that Noah is dealing with in the decision to obey God's command of him to build the ark. That's decision number one. Decision number two that takes place before the ark is not about building the ark, but is in relaying some of this information to people around him or arguing with God. Or is it staying silence? In both of those cases, at least according to the text in the Bible itself, some might argue, Noah chooses a dual level of silence. In history, and even in fiction, when certain people faced looming disaster, some of them went to sound the alarm. In children's stories, Chicken Little runs through town frantically exclaiming, "The sky is falling! The sky is falling!" Paul Revere rides through the night with his urgent cry, not that the British are coming. That is what we learned, and that's the folklore of it. What it is believed that he actually said is the regulars are coming, the regulars are out, because he was talking about regulars being the regular patrols. They sounded the alarm. And then, of course, in the Bible, there's Jonah, who initially resists God's command to go to Nineveh. And we know the rest of that part of the story. But ultimately in that book, he does travel to Nineveh, and he is compelled to warn the people of their impending judgment and potential punishment at the hands of God. Each of these figures sees danger and feels bound to alert others, whether out of fear, urgency, or divine compulsion. But Noah, by contrast, makes a profoundly different choice. Though he knows and he believes that the flood is coming, he embraces silence on two fronts. First, toward God, accepting the divine judgment without question or protest, and then towards his generation, choosing not to warn or urge them to change. Yes, they see him build the ark. And as he builds the ark, he does not, according to the text, explain his actions. He does not plead for mercy, and he does not speak of the coming flood. His silence serves as both a shield and a boundary, protecting him from the full moral weight of his mission, but isolating him from those who will not survive. Unlike Chicken Little's panic, Revere's rally, or Jonah's reluctant warning, Noah's choice is one of quiet, resolute obedience. He takes on the responsibility of knowledge alone, bearing the silent burden of his decision, a burden that shields him yet separates him from all he knows, and I would say that has incredible consequences for him later on in life. Let's then break that down into two parts. Silence toward God. Noah's silence towards God can be seen as a form of what you might call self-preservation through detachment. I think that's one way to look at it from a psychological perspective. By not arguing with God or seeking an explanation, Noah creates a mental boundary that allows him to focus solely on his task. He separates out the moral side of this from the active side of it. It's an absolute surrender to the divine authority, a belief that his role as a human in this case excludes moral judgment. And unlike Abraham, who would later plead for the righteous within Sodom and plead for the people of Sodom, Noah does not see himself as an advocate. He does not put himself into that space. He does not do what Abraham does later on. He does not do what Moses does later on either. His obedience to God is so complete that it leaves no room for questioning. even if it means distancing himself from the ethical weight of what's coming. You could also say and view this as silence as reverential fear, an instinct to accept divine commands without engaging in a debate. There is something to that. Noah's obedience isn't just compliance. It's a deliberate choice to detach himself from the moral implications of his mission, to avoid the emotional toll of questioning a judgment he perhaps cannot influence. We don't know because it does not appear that he did anything. His silence toward God reveals a complex blend of functional detachment and moral resignation, a belief that his task is limited to obedience and that challenging the plan would undermine his purpose. Think about that for just a minute when it is the case that you've had those situations where you've had a task before you that had that level of, you might call, moral balance at play at the same moment. What did you do? How did you act? On the flip side of that, there's also his silence toward his generation. Whereas you might say he cannot influence God in the decision, maybe he can influence the people. Or in Abraham's case, where Abraham feels he can influence God, but has no influence on the people. So equally significant is Noah's silence toward the people around him. He chooses not to warn them, not to explain his actions, not to plead for their change or redemption. Perhaps if somebody came up to him and asked him if he was building an ark, he would say, I'm building an ark because there's a flood coming. And people would mock him or laugh at him or think he's out of his mind. The silence around it creates an emotional boundary that isolates him from his community, allowing him to focus on his mission without becoming entangled in their fate. His family knows, his family believes, and his family also knows that they're going to be saved. But everybody else, not so much. Pleading with his generation would mean forming connections, experiencing a level of empathy, and ultimately bearing the pain of knowing that many will not survive. He is already, on some level, distinct and separate from all those people that are around him. Being a God-fearing and righteous person to begin with already separates him. But maybe it's beyond that. And maybe for us to appreciate that, we can appreciate it maybe not so much in the space of being a godly human being, but from the space of emotional self-preservation, a way to avoid the attachment to those situations and those people that he cannot save, and then to protect his own mental clarity so that he can focus on the work at hand in building the ark. But it also, perhaps negatively, shows a certain level of moral disengagement. By choosing not to speak, Noah limits his responsibility to those within the ark, creating a mental boundary between his own survival and the fate of those around him. He views his role as functional rather than relational, seeing the task as a matter of execution rather than a task of advocacy. His silence can be understood as maybe, again, something that I think we all can connect with, a defense mechanism, one that shields him from the moral complexity of his choices, yet isolates him as he completes his mission. I think we've been all been in that space. And maybe let's even take it a little bit further. His dual silence, both sides of that silence, raises deeper ethical questions about obedience versus our moral responsibility. Was Noah's loyalty to God at odds with compassion for humanity? Should he have challenged the judgment, or at least warned his generation? By choosing silence in both directions, Noah emphasized obedience over empathy, seeing his role as one of the survival rather than of advocacy. His silence reflects a choice to prioritize duty over connection, suggesting a belief that his task excludes moral judgment, like we said before. But if we're going to go into this space, then perhaps we have to go all the way into this space. At what point does silence become complicity? I'm not saying that Noah is complicit in the flood or complicit in the destruction of humanity. But once we're in the space of discussing obedience or silence of this nature in the human space, when does that roll into or over the boundary between simply being silence and becoming complicity? Again, Thinking inside the space of the modern situation, people not standing up for others, people not speaking out, people with influence, people with power staying silent out of fear, out of the concern of repercussions. Is that some level of moral disengagement? I imagine that it is. If the role of the person is to become purely functional, and while that may allow a person to complete their mission, it does still keep them in the space of carrying the ethical weight of those decisions. Silence in the case of Noah, or in the case of somebody else, acts as both a protection and a burden, shielding him in the short term, but isolating him in the long term. So think about the following example. Consider you're a government employee. You witness unethical practices within your agency, or you're an executive, or you're a member of a team, and you're aware of the harm that some of your policies are causing others. You may feel compelled to stay silent out of fear, out of loyalty, or belief that your current role, position, status excludes you from advocacy. You're not in whistleblower places. Like Noah, you choose self-preservation, perhaps rationalizing that silence remains necessary to fulfill your duties. But this silence does build inner conflict, a tension between the personal values and the institutional loyalty. At some point, you may have to choose. Imagine the complexity of the decision, protecting oneself by complying, yet dealing with the moral weight that silence creates. For individuals like that, the silence becomes both a shield and a source of inner conflict, a choice that may serve them in the short term, but leave them questioning their integrity in the long term. Maybe in many cases, not even appreciating what is at root for them later on. So let's move it back into our space for just a couple minutes. Have you ever chosen silence as a form of self-protection, even when speaking up felt like a moral obligation? You know, you're in a classroom, you're a little kid, you see maybe the teacher does something or says something that you found inappropriate, but you're a kid. It's your word against theirs. Do you open your mouth? Do you stand up in an appropriate way? But do you do so? Did that silence, if you chose silence, bring you peace? Or did it create a burden that you carry? Did it foment something inside you? Did it inspire or ignite something inside you that later on, when those situations came up again, you refused to be silent? Or maybe there's a situation in your life where silence served you well. That could be. You held back. We talked about that before. Where there was an opportunity to say something, but you decided there's a better moment for this than now. Or where your silence left you very much feeling regretful for not having said something. Then therefore, how do you weigh the self-preservation aspect of it against the moral responsibility aspect of it? I shared with a group last week, I gave a presentation on anonymity. And I talked about a student of mine years ago from a Middle East curriculum that I taught, who operated in anonymity when she wanted to debate people on YouTube. So she was anonymous. She had a screen name, a username that was not obvious as to who she was, and she would argue there. But I had another student who had no problems and no qualms standing up and arguing with professors about the Middle East conflict. This is years ago, not even the current climate. Imagine. She had no problem getting up and arguing in public in front of classmates, in front of an entire lecture hall, with a professor on that subject. So there's the moral responsibility piece versus the self-preservation piece, which is the person's grade. What do you do with that? Or have you ever felt that your role excluded you from advocating for others? You're like a sideshow, or you have no way to have any say or sway in the situation. And then how did that affect your belief in your sense of purpose and integrity and your potential impact in the world when it is that you had no voice or had no weight to say anything. And that's Noah. That's many of us, is on one side, the obedience to the task at hand, and on the other side, struggling mightily with the silence. These are at the foundation of Noah's journey. In choosing to act without understanding and to remain silent toward both God and his generation, Noah's path becomes a story of protective detachment. His choices shield him from emotional conflict, allowing him to fulfill his purpose, but isolating him with the ethical weight of his own survival. And so I would implore you, as you think about how you make decisions, as you think about how you choose between A and B, not on the simple level, but on the secondary and the third level, and these deep moral ethical situations. What are the factors that you consider when your decisions are in play? What are the issues that you hold dear? Where are the red lines? Where are the things that you won't cross? What are the things that you can never stay silent for? What are the things that you absolutely have to open your mouth for and stand up for and be counted for? When are you Noah? And when are you not Noah? And to finish, as we always do, with the quote again from Martin Luther King. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Thanks so much for listening. As always, I ask you and appreciate your input, your feedback, your critiques, your comments, your criticisms, your thinking as well on the subject. This is new for me here, so I'm interested in everything that people have to share, and I'd love to know what you have to share. Look forward to seeing you next week as we dive into the beginnings of the story of Abraham. That's Coaching the Bible for this week. Take care.